Benito Mussolini was an Italian dictator and journalist who founded and led the National Fascist Party. He was the Prime Minister of Italy from March on Rome in 1922 until his disposition in 1943, as well as Duke of Italian Fascism from the establishment of the Italian Forces of Combat in 1919 until his summary execution in 1945 by Italian partisans. As dictator of Italy and principal founder of fascism, Mussolini inspired and supported the international spread of fascist movements during the interwar period. Mussolini was originally a socialist politician and a journalist at the Avanti newspaper. In 1912, he became a member of the National Directorate of the Italian Socialist Party, but he was expelled from the PSI for advocating military intervention in the World War I in opposition to the party's stance on neutrality. In 1914, Mussolini founded a newspaper, Popolo d'Italia, and served in the Royal Italian Army during the war until he was wounded and discharged in 1917. Mussolini denounced the PSI, his views on now centering on Italian nationalism instead of socialism, and later founded the fascist movement, which came to oppose egalitarianism and class conflict, instead advocating revolutionary nationalism transcending class lines. On 31st October 1922, following the march on Rome 28th to 30th October, Mussolini was appointed Prime Minister by King Victor Emmanuel III, becoming the youngest individual to hold the office up to that time. After removing all political opposition through his secret police and outlawing labor strike, Mussolini and his followers consolidated power through a series of laws that transformed the nation into a one-party dictatorship. Within 5 years, Mussolini had established the dictatorial authority by both legal and illegal means and aspired to create a totalitarian state. In 1929, Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty with the Holy See to establish the Vatican City. Mussolini's foreign policy aimed to expand the Italian possessions and the fascist sphere of influence. In the 1920s, he ordered the pacification of Libya, instructed the bombing of Corfu over an incident with Greece, and established a protectorate over Albania and incorporated the city of Fiume into the Italian state via agreements with Yugoslavia. In 1936, Ethiopia was conquered following the Second Italo-Ethiopian War and merged into Italian East Africa (AOI) with Eritrea and Somalia. In 1939, Italian forces annexed Albania between 1936 and 1939. Mussolini ordered the Italian military intervention in Spain in favor of Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. At the same time, Mussolini initially tried to retain the status quo established after the World War I by sending troops at the Brana Pass to delay Angstulas and taking part in the Treaty of Lausanne, the Leighton Report, the Four-Power Pact, and the Stresa Front. However, he ultimately alienated the democratic powers following growing opposition to Italy within the League of Nations, which he left in 1937, and now hostile to France and Britain. Italy formed the Axis alliance with Germany and Japan. The wars of the 1930s, although successful, had costed Italy enormous resources. The fascist regime had thus delayed the rearmament, and the country was unprepared for the upcoming Second World War. Therefore, when Poland was invaded on 1st September 1939, Mussolini declared Italy's belligerence on 10th June 1940, believing that Allied defeat was imminent. He decided to join the war on the side of Germany to share the potential spoils of victory. Yet the conflict proved to be far from over after 3 years of campaigns in France, East Africa, the Sahara, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. Fought with an equipment largely dating back to World War I and suffering significant casualties, the Italians were tired of war, while the tide of the conflict had turned in favor of the Allies following the invasion of Sicily and a motion of no confidence passed by the Grand Council of Fascism. King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini as head of government and placed him in custody. After the king agreed to armistice with the Allies on 12 September 1943, Mussolini was rescued from captivity in the Grand Sasso raid by German paratroopers and Waffen-SS commandos led by Major Otto Harald Moos. Adolf Hitler, after meeting with the rescued former dictator, then put Mussolini in charge of a puppet state in German-occupied northern Italy. The Italian Social Republic, initially known as the Saio Republic, which served as a collaborationism regime of the Germans in their fight against the Allies, the Kingdom of Italy, now a co-belligerent of the Allies and the Italian resistance. In the late April 1945, in the wake of near-total defeat, Mussolini and his mistress Carla Petacci attempted to flee to Switzerland, but both were captured by Italian communist partisans and summarily executed by a firing squad on 28 April 1945 near Lake Como. The bodies of Mussolini and his mistress were taken to Milan, where they were hung upside down at a service station to publicly confirm their demise. Mussolini was born on 29 July 1883 in Ndovia di Predapio, a small town in the province of Folli in Romagna. Later, during the fascist era, Prodapio was dubbed Jesus' town and Folli was called Jesus City, with pilgrims going to Prodapio and Folli to see the birthplace of Mussolini. In 1902, Mussolini emigrated to Switzerland partly to avoid compulsory military service. He worked briefly as a stonemason in Geneva, Freiburg and Bern, but was unable to find a permanent job. In February 1909, Mussolini again left Italy, this time to take the job as a secretary of the Labour Party in the Italian-speaking city of Trento, which at that time was part of Austria-Hungary. It is now within Italy. He also did office work for local socialist party and edited its newspaper, The Future of the Worker. Returning to Italy, he spent a brief time in Milan, and in 1910 he returned to his hometown of Folli, where he edited the weekly The Class Struggle. When World War I began in 1st August 1914, a large number of socialist parties worldwide followed the rising nationalist current and supported their country's intervention in the war. In Italy, the outbreak of the war created a surge of Italian nationalism, and intervention was supported by a variety of political factions. One of the most prominent and popular Italian nationalist supporters of the war was Gabriele D'Annunzio, who promoted Italian irredentism and helped sway the Italian public to support the intervention in the war. The Italian Liberal Party, under the leadership of Paolo Boselli, promoted intervention in the war on the side of the Allies and utilized the Società Dante Alighieri to promote Italian nationalism. Italian socialists were divided on whether to support the war or oppose it. Prior to Mussolini taking a position on the war, a number of revolutionary syndicates had announced their support of intervention, including Alzetta de Ambris, Filippo Caridoni and Angelo Oliviero Olivetti. The Italian Socialist Party decided to oppose the war after the anti-militarist protesters had been killed, resulting in a general strike called the Red Week. Mussolini initially held official support for the party's decision, and in August 1914 article, Mussolini wrote down, "With the war we remain neutral." He saw war as an opportunity for both his own ambitions as well as those of socialists and Italians. He was influenced by the anti-Austrian Italian nationalist sentiments, believing that the war was offered Italians in Austria-Hungary the chance to liberate themselves from the rule of Augsburgs. He eventually decided to declare support for the war by appealing to the need for socialists to overthrow the Hohenzollern and Habsburg monarchies in Germany and Austria-Hungary, who he said had constantly repressed socialism. After being ousted by the Italian socialist parties for his support of Italian intervention, Mussolini made a radical transformation, ending his support for the class conflict and joining in support of revolutionary nationalism, transcending class lines. He formed the interventionist newspaper Revolutionary Forces of International Action in October 1940. His nationalist support of intervention enabled him to raise funds from the Ansaldo, the armaments firm, and other companies to convince socialists and to create Popolo d'Italia to convince socialists and revolutionists to support the war. Further funding for Mussolini's forces during the war came from French sources beginning in May 1915. A major source of this funding for France is believed to have been from French socialists who sent support to dissident socialists who wanted Italian intervention on France's side. By the time he returned from service in the Allied forces of World War I, very little remained of Mussolini the socialist. Indeed, he was now convinced that socialism as a doctrine had largely been a failure. In 1917, Mussolini got his start in politics with the help of €100 million weekly wage, the equivalent of €7,100 as of 2020, from the British Security Service MI5 to keep anti-war protesters at home and to publish pro-war propaganda. This help was authorized by Sir Samuel O'Hare, who was posted in Italy at the time when Britain feared the unavailability of that ally in the war and the possibility of an anti-war movement causing factory strikes. In early 1918, Mussolini called for the emergence of a man ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep to revive the Italian nation. Much later, Mussolini said he felt by 1919, socialism as a doctrine was already dead. It continued to exist only as a grudge. On 29 March 1919, Mussolini reformed the Milan Fascio as the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, Italian combat squad consisting of 200 members. In the night of between 27 and 28 October 1922, about 30,000 fascist black shirts gathered in Rome to demand the resignation of rebel Prime Minister Luigi Facta and the appointment of a new fascist government on the morning of 28 October. King Victor Emmanuel III, who according to the Albertine Statute held the supreme military power, refused the government request to declare martial law, which led to Facta's resignation. The king then handed over power to Mussolini, who stayed in his headquarters in Milan during the talks, but asking him to form a new government. The king's controversial decision had been explained by historians as a combination of delusions and fears. Mussolini enjoyed wide support in the military among the industrial and agrarian elites, while the king and conservative establishment were afraid of a possible civil war and ultimately thought they could use Mussolini to restore law and order in the country, but failed to foresee the danger of a totalitarian evolution. As a prime minister, the first years of Mussolini's rule were characterized by a right-wing coalition government composed of fascist, nationalist, liberals, and two Catholic clerics from the People's Party. The fascists made up of a small minority in his original governments. Mussolini's domestic goal was the eventual establishment of a totalitarian state with himself as the supreme leader, Duce II. A message that was articulated by the fascist newspaper Polo d'Italia, which was now edited by Mussolini's brother Arnaldo. To that end, Mussolini obtained from the dictatorial powers for 1 year, legal under the Italian constitution of the time. He favored the complete restoration of state authority with the integration of the Italian forces of combat into the armed forces, the foundation in January 1923 of the voluntary militia for national security, and the progressive identification of the party with the state. In political and social economy, passed legislation that favored the wealthy industrial and agrarian classes, privatization, liberalization, and rent laws, and dismantlement of the unions. In June 1923, the government passed the Assembly law, which transformed Italy into a single national constituency. It also granted a two-thirds majority of the seats in parliament to the party or group of parties that received at least 25% of the votes. This law applied in the elections of 6th April 1924. The National Alliance, consisting of fascists, most of the old liberals, and others, won 64% of the vote. The assassination of the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti, who had requested that the election be annulled because of the irregularities, provoked a momentary crisis in the Mussolini government. Mussolini ordered a cover-up, but witnesses saw the car that transported Matteotti's body parked outside the Matteotti's residence, which linked Amerigo Domini to the murder. German-American historian Konrad Jarusa argued that Mussolini was responsible for an integrated suite of political innovation that made fascism a powerful force in Europe. First, he went beyond the vague promise of future national renewal and proved the movement could actually seize power and operate a comprehensive government in a major country along with fascist lines. Secondly, the movement claimed to represent the entire national community, not a fragment such as the working class or the aristocracy. He made a significant effort to include the previously alienated Catholic element. He defined the public roles for the main sectors of the business community rather than allowing it to operate backstage. Third, he developed a cult of one-man leadership that focused media attention and national debate on his own personality. As a former journalist, Mussolini proved highly adept at exploiting all forms of mass media, including such new forms as motion pictures and radio. Fourth, he created a mass membership party with free programs for young men, young women, and various other groups who could therefore be more readily mobilized and monitored. He shut down all alternative political formations and parties, but this step was not an innovation by any means. Like all the dictators, he made liberal use of the threat of extrajudicial violence as well as actual violence by his black shirts to threaten his opposition. Between 1925 and 1927, Mussolini progressively dismantled virtually all constitutional and conventional restraints on his power and built a police state. A law passed on 24 December 1925, Christmas Eve, for the largely Roman Catholic country, changed Mussolini's formal title from President of the Council of Ministers to Head of Government. Although he was still called Prime Minister by most non-Italian news sources, he was no longer responsible to Parliament and could be removed only by the king. While the Italian constitution stated that the ministers were responsible to the sovereign, in practice that to become all but impossible to govern against the express will of Parliament. The Christmas Eve law ended this practice and also made Mussolini the only person competent to determine the body's agenda. This law transformed Mussolini's government into a de facto legal dictatorship. Local autonomy was abolished and body stats appointed by the Italian Senate replaced elected mayors and councils. In 1919, the Italian state had brought a series of liberal reforms in Libya that allowed education in Arabic and Berber and allowed for the possibility that the Libyans might become Italian citizens. Giuseppe Volpi, who had been appointed governor in 1921, was retained by Mussolini and withdrew all of the measures offering equality to the Libyans. A policy of confiscating land from the Libyans to hand over to Italian colonies gave new vigor to Libyan resistance led by Omar Mukhtar, and during the ensuing persecution of Libya, the fascist regime waged a genocidal campaign designed to kill as many Libyans as possible. While over half the population of Cyrenaica were confined to 15 concentration camps by 1931, while the Royal Italian Air Force staged the chemical warfare against the Bedouin. On 20 June 1930, Marshal Pietro Badoglio wrote to General Rodolfo Ghizzani saying, "As for overall strategy, it is necessary to create a significant and clear separation between the controlled population and the rebel formations. I do not hide the significance and the seriousness of this measure, which might be the ruin of the subdued population. But now the course has been set, and we must carry it out and to the end, even if the entire population of Cyrenaica must perish." Mussolini launched several public construction programs and government initiatives throughout Italy to combat economic setbacks or unemployment levels. His earliest and one of the best known was the Battle for Wheat, by which 5,000 new farms were established and a few new agricultural towns among them Vittoria and Sabuda, and land reclaimed by draining the Potine marshes. In Sardinia, a model agricultural town was founded and named Mussolini, but has long since been named Borea. This town was the first of what Mussolini hoped would have been thousands of new agricultural settlements across the country. The battle for wheat diverted valuable resources to wheat production away from the more economically viable crops. Landowners grew on wheat on unsuitable soil using all advances of modern science, and although the wheat harvested increased, price rose, consumption fell, and high tariffs were imposed. The tariffs promoted widespread inefficiencies, and the government subsidies given to farmers pushed the country further into debt. Mussolini was keen to take the credit for major public works in Italy, particularly the railway system. His reported overhauling of the railway network led to the popular saying, "Say what you like about Mussolini, he made the trains to run on time." Kenneth Robert, journalist and novelist, wrote in 1924. The difference between the Italian railway service in 1920 and 1921 and that which obtained during the first year of the Mussolini regime was almost beyond belief. The cars were clean, the employees were snappy and cautious, and the trains arrived at and left the stations on time, and not 15 minutes late, and not 5 minutes late, but on the minute. Mussolini's foremost priority was the subjugation of the minds of the Italian people through the use of propaganda. The regime promoted a lavish cult of personality centered on the figure of Mussolini. He pretended to incarnate the new fascist Umbernisch, promoting an aesthetic of exasperated machismo that attributed to him quasi-divine capacity. At various times after 1922, Mussolini personally took over the ministries of Interior, Foreign Affairs, Colonies, Cooperation, Defense, and Public Works. Sometimes he held as many as 7 departments simultaneously, as well as premiership. He was also the head of all-powerful fascist party and the armed local fascist militia, the MFVCN or Black Shirts, who terrorized incipient resistance in the city and provinces. He would later form the OVRA, an international secret police that carried out official state support. In this way, he succeeded in keeping power in his own hands and preventing the emergence of any rival. Culture. Nationalists in the years after World War I thought of themselves as combating the liberal domineering institutions created by cabinets such as those of Giovanni Giolitti, including traditional schooling. Futurism, a revolutionary cultural movement which will serve as catalyst for fascism, argued for a school for physical courage and patriotism as expressed by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti in 1919. Marinetti expressed this disdain by now prehistoric and Troglodytic ancient Greek and Latin courses, arguing for their replacement with the exercise modeled on those of the Aditi soldiers, learning to advance on hands and knees in front of machine gun fire, to wait open-eyed for crossbeam to move sideways over their heads. It was in those years that the first fascist youth wings were formed, Uganda fascist youth vanguards in 1919 and Gruppi Universitari fascist university groups in 1922. In foreign policy, Mussolini was pragmatic and opportunistic. At the center of his vision lay the dream to forge a new Roman Empire in Africa and the Balkans, vindicating the so-called mutilated victory of 1980 imposed by the pseudo-democracies Britain and France that betrayed the Treaty of London and usurped the supposed natural right of Italy to achieve supremacy in the Mediterranean basin. However, in the 1920s, given the Germany's weakness, the post-war reconstruction problems, and the question of reparation, the situation of Europe was too unfavorable to advocate an openly revisionist approach to the Treaty of Versailles. In the 1920s, Italy's foreign policy was based on the traditional idea of Italy maintaining equidistant stance from all the major powers in order to exercise determinant weight, which by whatever power Italy chose to align with will decisively change the balance of power in Europe, and the price of such an alignment will be supported for Italian ambitions in Europe and Africa. In the meantime, since for Mussolini demography was destined, he carried out relentless natalist policies designed to increase the birth rate. For example, in 1924 advocating or giving information about contraception a criminal offense, and in 1926 ordering every Italian woman to double the number of children that they are willing to bear. For Mussolini, Italy's current population of 40 million was sufficient to fight a major war, and he needed to increase the population to at least 60 million Italians before he would be ready for war. By the late 1930s, Mussolini's obsession with demography led him to conclude that Britain and France were finished as powers, and it was Germany and Italy who were destined to rule Europe, if for no other reason than their demographic strength. Mussolini stated that this belief that the declining birth rates in France were absolutely horrifying, and that the British Empire was doomed because 1/4 of the British population was over 50. As such, Mussolini believed that an alliance with Germany was preferable to an alignment with Britain and France, as it was better to be allied with the strong instead of the weak. Mussolini saw the international relations as a social Darwinian struggle between the vile nations and with high birth rates that were destined to destroy affected nations with low birth rates. Mussolini believed that France was a weak and old nation, as the French weekly death rate exceeded the birth rate by 2000, and he had no interest in alliance with the France. As World War II began, Siano and Viscount Halifax were all in secret form of conversation. The British wanted Italy on their side against Germany, as it had been in World War I. French government opinion was more geared towards action against Italy, as they were eager to attack Italy in Libya. In September 1939, France swung to the opposition extreme, offering to discuss issues with Italy. But as the French were unwilling to discuss Corsica, Nice and Savoy, Mussolini did not answer. Mussolini's Under-Secretary for War Production, Carlo Fagarosa, had estimated that Italy could not be prepared for major military operations until 1942 due to its relatively weak industrial sector compared to Western Europe. In late November 1939, Adolf Hitler declared, "So long as the Deutsch lives, one can rest assured that Italy will seize every opportunity to achieve its imperialistic aim." In September 1940, the Italian 10th Army was commanded by General Rodolfo Graziani and crossed from Italian Libya into Egypt, where British forces were located. This will become the Western Desert Campaign. Advances were successful, but the Italians stopped at Sidi Barrani, waiting for logistic supplies to catch up. On 24 October 1940, Mussolini sent the Italian Air Corps to Belgium, where it took part in the builds until January 1941. In October, Mussolini also sent Italian forces into Greece, stating that the Greco-Italian War, the Royal Air Force, prevented the Italian invasion and allowed the Greeks to push the Italians back to Albania, but the Greek counteroffensive in Albania ended in a stalemate. By 1943, Italy's military position had become unattainable. Axis forces in North Africa were finally defeated in the Tunisia campaign in early 1943. Italy suffered major setbacks on the Eastern Front as well. The Allied invasion of Sicily brought the war to the nation's very doorstep. The Italian home front was also in bad shape, as the Allied bombings were taking their toll. Factories all over Italy were brought to a virtual standstill because raw materials such as coal and oil were lacking. Additionally, there was a chronic shortage of food, and what food was available was being sold at nearly confiscatory prices. Mussolini's once ubiquitous propaganda machine lost its grip on the people. A large number of Italians turned to Vatican Radio or Radio London for more accurate news coverage. Discontent came to a head in March 1943 with a wave of labor strikes in the industrial north, the first large-scale strikes since 1925. Also in March, some of the major factories in Milan and Turin stopped production to secure evacuation allowances for workers' families. The German presence in Italy had sharply turned public opinion against Mussolini. For example, when Allies invaded Sicily, the majority of the public there welcomed them as liberators. Only 2 months after Mussolini had been dismissed and arrested, he was recused from his prison at the Hotel Campo Imperatore in the Gran Sasso raid on 12 September 1943 by a special Fleischberger paratroopers until the Waffen SS commandos led by Major Otto Erald Moos Otto Sozenki was also present. The rescue saved Mussolini from being turned over to the Allies in accordance with the armistice. Hitler had made plans to arrest the king, the Crown Prince Umberto Badoglio, and the rest of the government and restore Mussolini to power in Rome, but the government's escape sought likely foiled those plans. On 25th April 1945, Allied troops were advancing into northern Italy, and the collapse of the Sao Republic was imminent, Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci set out for Switzerland, intending to board a plane and escape to Spain. 2 days later, on 27th April, they were stopped near a village of Dongo, Lake Como, by communist partisans named Valerio and Bellini and identified by the political commissar of the partisans, 52nd Ibaldi Brigade, Urbano Lazaro. During this time, Pataki's brother posed as a Spanish consul. On 29 April 1945, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and other executed fascists were loaded into a van and moved south to Milan. At 3 a.m., the corpses were dumped on the ground in the old Pizzelle Rodeto. The piazza had been renamed Piazza Guidini Martini, 15 Matthias Square, in honor of the 15 Italian partisans recently executed there. Mussolini's first wife, Ida Dalsa, whom he married in 1914, the couple had a son following a year and named him Benito Albino Mussolini. In December 1915, Mussolini married Rachel Guidi, who had been his mistress since 1910. Due to his upcoming political ascendancy, the information about his first marriage was suppressed, and both his first wife and son were later persecuted. With Rachel, Mussolini had 2 daughters, Eda 1910 to 1995 and Anna Maria 1929 to 1968. The latter of whom married in Ravenna on 11 June 1960 to Nando Pucci Negri, and 3 sons, Vittorio 1916 to 1987, Bruno 1918 to 1941, and Romano 1927 to 2006. Mussolini had several mistresses, among them Margherita Sefrate and his final companion Clara Petacci. Mussolini had many brief sexual encounters with female supporters, as reported by his biographer Nicolas Farrell. Mussolini was raised by a devotedly Catholic mother and an anti-clerical father. His mother Rosa had him baptized in the Roman Catholic Church and took her children to services early every Sunday. His father never attended. Mussolini regarded his time at a religious boarding school as a punishment compared to the experience to hell, and once refused to go to morning mass and had to be dragged there by force. Despite making such attacks, Mussolini tried to win popular support by appeasing the Catholic majority in Italy. In 1924, Mussolini saw that the 3 of his children were given communion. In 1925, he had a priest perform a religious marriage ceremony for himself and his wife Rachel, whom he had married in a civil ceremony for 10 years earlier. On 11 February 1921, he signed a concordat and a treaty with the Roman Catholic Church. Under the Lateran Pact, Vatican City was granted independent statehood and placed under church law, rather than Italian law, and the Catholic religion was recognized as Italy's state religion. The church also regained authority over marriage. Catholicism could be taught in all secondary schools, birth control and Freemasonry were banned, and the clergy received subsidies from the state and was exempted from taxation. Pope Pius XI praised Mussolini, and the official Catholic newspaper pronounced that Italy has been given back to God and God to Italy. Over the span of his career, Mussolini's views and policies regarding Jews and anti-Semitism were often inconsistent, contradictory, and radically shifted depending on the situation. Most historians have generally labeled him as a political opportunist when it came to the treatment of the Jews rather than following a sincere belief. Mussolini considered Italian Jews to be Italians, but his belief may have been influenced by more anti-clericalism and the general mood of the Italy at the time, which denounced the abusive treatment of the Jews in the Roman ghetto by the Papal States until the unification of Italy. Although Mussolini had initially disregarded biological racism, he was a firm believer in national traits and made several generalizations about Jews. Mussolini blamed the Russian Revolution of 1917 on Jewish vengeance against Christianity with the remark, "Race does not betray race. Bolshevism is being defended by the international plutocracy. That is the real truth." He also made an assertion that 80% of Soviet leaders were Jewish, yet within a few weeks he contradicted himself with the remark, "Bolshevism is not as people believe a Jewish phenomenon. The truth is that Bolshevism is leading to the utter ruin of the Jews of the Eastern Europe." Mussolini was survived by his wife Rachel Mussolini, 2 sons Vittorio and Romano Mussolini, and his daughters Eda, the widow of Count Ciano, and Anna Maria. The third son Bruno was killed in an air accident while flying a Piaggio P-108 bomber on a test mission on 7 August 1941. His oldest son Benito Albino Mussolini, from his marriage with Ida Delsa, was ordered to stop declaring that Mussolini was his father, and in 1935 forcibly committed to an asylum in Milan, where he was murdered on 26 August 1942 after repeated coma-inducing injections. Although the National Fascist Party was outlawed by the post-war constitution of Italy, a number of successor neo-fascist parties emerged to carry on its legacy. Historically, the largest neo-fascist party was the Italian Social Movement, which disbanded in 1995 and was replaced by National Alliance, a conservative party that distanced itself from fascism. Declared during an official visit to Israel that fascism was an absolute evil. National Alliance and a number of neo-fascist parties were merged in 2009 to create a short-lived of Freedom Party led by then Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, which eventually disbanded after the defeat in the 2013 general election. In 2012, many former members of the National Alliance joined the Brothers of Italy, led by current Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. In February 2018, a poll conducted by the Demos and PI Research Institute found that out of 1,014 people interviewed, 19% of voters across the Italian political spectrum had a positive or very positive opinion of Mussolini. 60% saw him negatively and 21% did not have an opinion.